But our last story today, I was going to say, it gets us to the ongoing saga in New York, where a local outlet out there called The City did some digging into how the NYPD is currently handling gun permits, and found that they appear to be, at least, sitting on a lot of permits and slow walking them because the approval rate is well below what it was before Bruin was decided, before the Supreme Court tossed their permitting law. So it looks like that they are sitting on people's permitting applications, even as more and more people are applying for permits.
It's just like classic New York official thing to do, right? Like NYPD just disregarding the Supreme Court's ruling altogether and issuing fewer permits at a lower rate than they did before the Supreme Court struck down the state's gun carry permitting law for being too restrictive. Right? It's just amazing because you look at it, and I did an analysis piece on this. Combine that with the state's Bruin response law, where they're basically just doing what the Supreme Court told them they can't do, right? In terms of sensitive places, they just try to make all of New York a sensitive place when the Supreme Court's already explicitly said you can't do that. And, now the NYPD is, just freezing these applications for no good reason. It's not like they denied a bunch of them, right? As you alluded to there, that the denial rate didn't go up. In fact, the denial rate was very low for 2022, all right, the year that Bruin happened. But they just stopped making decisions, even though state law requires them to do it. Within, I think it was 2 months is the period they have to make these decisions. And they just blow through that because they just don't want to issue the permits. And I'm pretty sure that's not going to be a acceptable reasoning if this makes its way up to the Supreme Court. I mean, I just think this is another attempt by New York officials to just ignore what happened in Bruin. And it's really weird to watch them play this out strategically because it just seems like they're begging for another Supreme Court case.
I was just about to ask. I remember shortly after the Bruin response bill was passed, you wrote an analysis piece called New York Asks Supreme Court, Thank you, may I please have another? And this seems like a continuation in that trend.
Same idea.
They're just begging for someone to step in and say, we already said you can't do this. So why are, here's another injunction or here's another, they're just asking for judicial intervention for sure.
It's such a weird thing to watch. I mean, it's not, we've seen this kind of reaction before, right? You see this in cities a lot. Philadelphia does this all the time. In fact, we didn't mention it here, but I think it was in the links. Philadelphia launched another, a lawsuit against gun dealers, backed by every town. They're constantly passing ordinances that are illegal under state law that they know aren't going to stand up when they get to court, but they do it anyway because there's sort of a political benefit to it, and there's no, other than wasting a lot of money, city resources, which is a legitimate practical negative effect. Beyond that, there isn't any other, they're not risking arrest if they pass these illegal ordinances or anything like that. So, I mean, I guess, that seems to be what the New York lawmakers and law enforcement officials at large have settled into that point of view when it comes to the Supreme Court. But that seems disastrous for the gun control movement, in my estimation, because, think back to Washington, D.C., right? Washington, D.C. had a total ban on gun carry at one point. That was struck down by federal judges. Then, in response, instead of trying to carry that to the Supreme Court because they knew they would lose that case, they passed a law. They passed a May issue gun carry law. And then, of course, that got struck down, too. They were sort of one of the first in line for having their a couple of years before. They were kind of the canary in the coal mine for the gun control movement of this sort of thing, that these May issue restrictive gun carry laws weren't going to survive scrutiny anymore. And instead of appealing that to the Supreme Court, right, because they, again, thought they would lose, and they were explicit about this at the time, the Attorney General in D.C. was open about why they weren't going to appeal that decision. And it was because they thought they would lose, and that would be bad for the rest of the country in areas that had the same policies. They didn't want to be responsible for setting yet another Supreme Court precedent against the viewpoint of staunch gun control advocates. But New York itself seems to have absolutely no qualms about doing just that. I mean, they just lost the Supreme Court last year. It's been 1 year, right? June 2022. And they've already got a case that's fast-tracked through the Second Circuit. We're just waiting on a ruling there, and it's likely that the Supreme Court is going to take that case up because you've already got two justices, two of the most influential conservative justices, who said they think that the lower court that struck down the law did so in a thoughtful manner, and that they were mostly worried about the Second Circuit taking too long to review that case. And so it's really not far. I know a lot of people in the gun rights community are constantly worried that the Supreme Court's going to go back into hibernation on the Second Amendment, right? And that they're just going to wait another decade before they take another substantial case. But it doesn't seem like that's how they're approaching things at this point. They took Rahimi. I know that's not a case that gun rights advocates would prefer them to be the first follow-up to Bruin, but it is a Second Amendment case. And that's the third Second Amendment case in 3 years. They had the mooted one for the previous New York case that got mooted. But it seemed, and they've already spoken in this Antioch case in New York that, at least two justices, it was Thomas and Alito, and they're pretty influential justices on the court right now, that they don't, and so not in so many words, but they basically said, we agree with the lower court's ruling that this law is unconstitutional. And we just don't want to step on the toes of the Second Circuit and let them go through their process and get to their conclusion before we step in and do something. So it seems more likely than not to me that New York is going to be back in front of the Supreme Court because of these laws and also how they're enforcing them in practice. This NYPD situation will probably be at issue in that New York case when it reaches the Supreme Court, which could be as soon as next year.
Certainly. And it's worth pointing out that in the piece, we noted that there actually already is a class action lawsuit being filed on these delay tactics with the NYPD, because there's several gun owners saying, hey, it's been months and I don't have my permit, even though the statute clearly says you don't get to take, a year or 18 months to approve a permit. So that, that could be its own case. Like you said, it'll come up in the other lawsuits as well. So there's just a bunch of different avenues.
I think it'll be both.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like it'll come up as a point in the New York case against the overall law, would be my guess, because a lot of this happened after that. New York passed its Bureau response law pretty fast, right? Yeah. And so the requirements that the NYPD is judging these permits off of for most of the second half of 2022 were under that new law. And so the practical evidence that they just didn't issue permits will probably play a big role, especially convincing people like Kavanaugh and Roberts, because if you read that Kavanaugh-Roberts concurrence, and I talk about this in the analysis piece for members, but they're saying, shall issue permitting is fine as long as it's actually shall issue permitting, because as applied challenges will be perfectly acceptable if you if these jurisdictions don't actually implement real shall issue policies. If they're still doing stuff like this after the law is implemented, then that can be challenged. And it seems like those two justices would be on board. And I think you could bet the other four conservative justices would already be there on striking actions like that down as unconstitutional. So, the New York is kind of coming at it from all angles in terms of getting on the wrong side of all of these conservative justices, regardless of how conservative or moderate they may be in the spectrum of the Supreme Court.